learned about different types of sentences. We've learned about different types of verbs and the structure of sentences as you looked at different sentence patterns. Right now, what I want you to do is to listen for the different types of sentences. By this, I'm talking about declarative sentences and imperative sentences, interrogative as well as exclamatory, as well as for the characters that use them. Now, to do this, we're going to go ahead and look at our literature links. As we come down here, let's just go ahead and click on literature and look at the literature link.
Cook peered at Willie. Needs his hair cut. She nodded to Marie. Mind this floor, girl. Cook shuffled to the table. His breakfast is ready. He'd best be here on time tomorrow. I'll not make a second breakfast again. Another maid entered with a small basket full of rags. Some nanny you are, she said to Marie. If you don't quiet him soon, mistress will be here laying us all by the ears. She kneeled before the fire. One by one the rags went into the flames. Nasty things, so worn we can't even use them for cleaning. Look at this shirt. She held it up with thumb and forefinger. No child should have to wear such as this. She tossed the shirt into the fire. Mine! My shirt! You'll have more shirts and better and cleaner. She added more clothes to the fire. Mine! Willie ran to the basket and grabbed at his belongings. Marie dragged Willie back. Oh, do give him a shirt, Jillian. We can wash it, or give him those breeches, Marie pointed. I don't want to hear much more of his wailing. No, they're to be burned, all of them. Willie screamed. He kicked at Marie's legs, but she was too quick, and her skirts hit his targets. Give him whatever's cleanest, she said. I won't be scolded because of a screaming brat. Marie caught up the blue shawl and shoved it in Willie's face. Now be still, she hissed. Willie grabbed his mother's shawl and wadded it up against his chest. Mistress Perry swept into the kitchen. The maids jumped up and curtsied, standing with their eyes lowered and their hands clasped before them. Cook merely looked up for a moment. What is going on here? The whole house is disturbed. Mistress Perry's foot tapped impatiently. She addressed the younger girl. Jillian? Yes, Mum. Jillian curtsied again. Why is that child carrying on so? I suppose because I'm burning his old clothes. He wants them, Mum.
I trust that you listen to the characters in that, and we're trying to listen for the different types of sentences. That excerpt is from The Foundling, which is a novel by Linda Hayner, and you will find on page 1 of your book the actual words that you just heard. In fact, I'd like for you to turn to page 1 there because I want us to look at some of these words, look at some of the types of sentences, and just see what they tell us about the characters. You know, the kinds of sentences that characters use really reveal to us a lot about them. It reveals the relationships with the other characters. In fact, as you look at that, perhaps you want to even pause the program to read over it again. I want to ask you, which character uses the most imperative sentences? Remember what the imperative sentences are. Which character does that? It's the character Marie, isn't it? And it kind of gives you the idea that Marie is the bossy one. You know, if someone is always giving what's an imperative sentence, a command or request, they seem to be the bossy person, right? It tells us something else about Marie also. It tells us that she's probably just a little higher in position than Gillian, okay? Because she's the one that is constantly giving out the orders. Did you pick that up? As you read books on your own, look for the people that are giving imperative sentences. That will tell you something about their character, okay? About their relationship with the other characters. All right, how about the exclamations? Who uses a lot of exclamations? Willie does, doesn't he? He's saying, mine, my shirt, mine. He doesn't even use long sentences at all. In fact, what he is saying is just little fragments with a punctuation mark that is an exclamation point, telling us that he's got a lot of emotion here. You know, then there's somebody that asks questions. Who is that? That's the mistress, isn't it? Mistress Perry asks questions. She asks things like, what is going on here? Can't you just hear her asking that as she comes in? And why is this child carrying on so? She is the kind, she wants to know. You see, she wasn't part of the action there. She has just come in and she wants to know what is happening. And so why do you really suppose she asked these questions? Do you think that she's really asking them because she wants information? Or do you think as you read through this and as you listen to, do you think perhaps she had other motives for asking questions? When somebody asks you a question, do they ever have additional motives, some other reason why they're asking questions? Oftentimes they do, and that's something that you need to pay attention to. And as you are reading through literature, ask yourself, why did this character ask this question? Is it just to get information, or are they trying to say something else by that question? And I think in the way that Chuck Nicholas, who was the one that read that for you, I think in the way in which he portrayed Mistress Perry, you could tell that she was wanting a little bit more than that, okay? But let me just encourage you in your writing. Besides in your reading, as you read different types of sentences, in your writing, use different types of sentences because they will help you to better communicate your message. All right, that's kind of just a little side note here. I did want to cover that information from the first page, and we will be covering the information from the literature selections as we go throughout this book, okay? We won't always do it right at the beginning. In fact, usually we won't do it at the beginning. I want to give you a chance to learn something about the information in the chapter before we get to that and look at it actually in literature. But I would just encourage you to do one of two things here. Besides looking for this in other literature that you read, if you have not yet read The Foundling, that is a good piece of literature that I would suggest that you spend some time reading. All right, we are still in chapter 1, and I would like for you to turn, please, to, let's see, we are on page 11. So if you go ahead and turn to page 11 in your book, we're going to be talking about phrases and clauses. I want you to look at some groups of words here for a moment. In the house could be problematic, the talented freshman student, and of a play. All right, we're looking at these groups of words. What do you know about these groups of words? You know, as you think about them, what are they? Are they phrases? Are they clauses? How do you know? Well, I trust that you do know what they are. They are phrases. But more importantly than knowing that those words are called phrases is knowing what makes those groups of words to be phrases. So what is it? What is a phrase? If you had to give a definition of a phrase, what would you say? Well, a phrase contains more than one word. Of course, obviously you can't have just one word and have it be a phrase. But in addition to that, the words that are within that group are all related, aren't they? So we have a group of related words. That is a phrase. Now I'm going to give you some more words. All right, how about these? Car, yesterday, the asparagus gone. Do these words constitute a phrase? Well, I have a group of words, yes, but do they constitute a phrase? No, they don't. Why not? It's because these are just random words, just words that I threw out off the top of my head. They are not related at all, are they? All right, then let's look at another group of words. How about this one? I wanted a new bike. Now, I want to show you one other one here. I want you to compare these two. Although I couldn't afford one. Now, are these word groups different from the phrases that we just looked at? Yes, they are. Now, what is different? They're groups of words. They are related words, but these groups have something that that first group, the one that said in the house and ended it with a play, that they don't have. They have subjects and they have verbs, don't they? Now, when you think of subjects and verbs, you probably think of sentences. That's what I think of when I think about a subject and a verb. But are both of these sentences, let me let you look at them again, are both of these word groups sentences? I wanted a new bike, although I couldn't afford one. Now, I realize I don't have any end punctuation there, but let's say I had it all punctuated correctly. Would you say that both of those are sentences? No, they're not. Just the first one is. So why isn't that second one a sentence, although I couldn't afford one? Well, it has a little problem. You see, it doesn't express a complete thought because it contains what is called a subordinating word. That word although that it starts with, that lets us know, hey, this cannot be by itself. It has to be part of another sentence. So, what we're going to do is not call it a sentence. Instead, when we have groups of related words that have both a subject and a verb, we call those clauses. Now, I told you that page 11 gives you information about phrases and clauses, and that's what we're discussing. We've already talked about phrases, a group of related words. But now as we talk about clauses, we're going to break them into two parts. First of all, I want us to talk about the independent clause. Think about that word independent. Are you independent? In a lot of ways, I'm sure you are. And the older you get, the more independent you get. When I think of that word independent, I oftentimes think of a toddler. Someone who is trying their best to be independent from mom, yet is almost totally dependent on the mother. But what should we think about when we think about an independent clause? Well, this is a clause that expresses a complete thought. So we can look at that by itself and we say, yep, the entire thought is right there. And since that thought is right there, an independent clause is one that can stand alone. Now, it is often sometimes called the main clause. So if you've heard it referred to before as the main clause, that's fine. That's the same thing that I'm talking about, okay? Independent clause or main clause. Usually I will call it an independent clause, but I do want you to be familiar with both of those terms. All right, then we have the other type of clause, which is the dependent clause. Now, dependent, think about that word depend. You depend on your parents for other things, for some things, don't you? We all should depend on God to direct our lives. So what are we talking about when we say that something is dependent? It means it can't stand by itself. It instead has to be part of something else. So since we're talking about clauses, it has to be part of another sentence. In other words, it's got to be joined up with an independent clause. Dependent clause must also have an independent clause in order to have a sentence. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of dependent and independent clauses. Because I am sick, and after we go to church. Now I have labeled these as dependent clauses, and you should recognize that right away because of the first word that is there. But I do want you to also look for a subject and a verb, because we cannot have a clause unless we have the subject and a verb. So let's look at that first sentence. Where's the subject? Because I am sick. It may help you just to take off that subordinating word, take off the word because. What is the subject of I am sick? The subject is I, and the verb is what? It's a linking verb. The linking verb is am. All right, let's do the same thing for after we go to church. Take off the after. That's our subordinating word. That's, by the way, what makes it a dependent clause. And find the subject. The subject is we, and what do? We go, don't we? All right, so these are some dependent clauses, and I'm not going to belabor the point that they are dependent on something else. You can look at them and see, hey, that can't stand alone as a sentence. However, when we have an independent clause, that's the kind that can. The first one, I have pneumonia. All right, what is the subject of that sentence? The subject is I, and the verb, have. Now, fortunately, I do not have pneumonia, and I've never had pneumonia, but let me just encourage you with something. When you see a word like pneumonia, that might be a word that you want to add to your spelling list. If you're trying to keep track of some words that you need to learn to spell, that's a word that a lot of people have difficulty with. So you might want to add that into yours. All right, let's go ahead and look at that second sentence. A little bit easier to spell all the words here. We went to church this morning. How do you, what's the subject of this sentence? The subject is we, and what did we do? We went. So I have a subject and a verb. I know I have a clause. It can stand alone, so I have an independent clause. Well, I want us to consider now phrases and clauses, both independent and dependent, as we look at Practice the Skill 1-9, and this is on page 12. So if you'll go ahead and turn there, you'll see some groups of words, and you need to label those words. Now, you'll notice that the end punctuation is not there, so you can't say, oh, if it's got a period at the end, then I know it's a sentence, so that means it has to be an independent clause. No, it's been left out on purpose, so as you label them, I want you to do it this way. If it's a phrase, label it with a P, an independent clause, IC, and a dependent clause, DC. Now, it's helpful if you always use the same abbreviations that I use, and I'll be using the ones that are in your book. All right, let's look at that first one together. Acadia National Park is located in Maine. Do I have a subject and a verb? Sure I do. Acadia National Park is my subject, is the verb. I have an independent clause. Now, it could be a dependent clause if I put a subordinating word at the front, but I don't have a subordinating word. It can stand alone. All right, let's look at number 2. Where there are lakes and forests. Kind of sounds like it needs to go with the last sentence, doesn't it? It is a dependent clause. It does have a subject and a verb. All right, sentence number 3, or I shouldn't say sentence number 3, group of words number 3. Let's see whether it's a sentence or not. Acadia lies on a dozen islands. Okay, I was right. This is a sentence. It's an independent clause. And by the way, an independent clause is a simple sentence. So if you have an independent clause, you do indeed have a sentence. All right, group of words number 4. Mostly on Mount Desert Island. What is this? Is there a subject and a verb? No, this is just a group of words that are related, so we have a phrase. All right, number 5. The second most visited national park. Well, this gives us a nice description, but it doesn't even tell us what it's describing. It does not have a subject. It does not have a verb. It's most visited. That is a descriptive word, okay? That we'll get to when we talk about participles and gerunds and infinitives. All right, that's a participle in there. This is a phrase. Number 6, if you visit Acadia. Well, you could be a subject, visit is a verb, but what about that if word in front of it? That's a subordinating word that makes this a dependent clause. All right, number 7, you need to drive to the summit of Cadillac Mountain. Boy, that's a fact, isn't it? That's a declarative sentence. You just need to put a period right there at the end, don't you? And labeled, of course, as an independent clause. All right, let's look at number 8, the highest granite mountain on the eastern coast. We have a nice descriptive what? Phrase or clause? It's a nice descriptive phrase. There's not a subject and is not a verb. All right, number 9, hiking on 120 miles of hiking trails. Perhaps you would like to do that, but you is not the subject of this group of words. In fact, there isn't one, so we have a phrase. And then the last one, number 10. You will find some easy trails and some strenuous trails. Hey, that's a sentence that stands by itself, doesn't it? It has a subject, has a verb, so we'll label that as an independent clause. Now, as you can see, these are not very difficult. All you have to do is think, what is a phrase, what is a dependent clause, and what is an independent clause? And really, most of this information should be reviewed for you again, and it's important that we do review it. I don't expect that you've remembered all of this from all of your previous years of study. But if this stuff is just foreign to you, you might need to slow down, take it just a little bit easy, go through it step by step, but please learn it now. Don't wait until 10th grade and say, oh, I'll just learn it again next year. No, try to learn it all now. If you master it now, it's going to make things so much easier for you in the future, okay? I would like for you to identify some sentences, some independent clauses, some dependent clauses, some phrases on your own. And use the skill 110, which is on pages 12 and 13, has some very similar directions. However, this time, each of them are complete sentences. What you're going to do instead is to label the underlined group of words. So within this big sentence, you have some words that are underlined, and you're going to look at those words and say, okay, is this, which is part of a larger sentence, is it just a phrase, is it a dependent clause, or is it an independent clause? All right, if you would, then go ahead and pause the program and use the skill 110 on pages 12 and 13. Now, as we go through the answers to this, I want you to think as well as check your work, okay? I'm going to go ahead and give you the answer, and of course, if you missed it, then go ahead and mark the correct answer so that later when you come back and take a look at it, you'll say, oh yeah, I remember why I did that incorrectly. But I might do something else as well. I might ask you about some other words in that sentence and see if you can identify it as a phrase or a clause, okay, or depending on what type of clause it would be. But let's go ahead and look at number 1. All right, number 1, the answer is P. It is a phrase, the smallest Canadian province. But I want to ask you something here. What if I were to include that word is? If I were just to look at it and say, okay, instead of saying the smallest Canadian province, what if I said I want it to be is the smallest Canadian province? Then would I still have a phrase? What do you think? Adding that word is. Think about the definition of a phrase. Cannot have both a subject and a verb, but can it have either a subject or a verb? Sure it can. So if it has a verb but does not have a subject, as the case would be here where I just have is, then it's still a phrase. It cannot be a clause unless it has both the subject and the verb. Okay, so don't let that throw you. I know for a while it threw me when I was growing up. So I want to make sure that you get that right. All right, let's look at number 2. This is a dependent clause. Notice it starts with the word even. All right, so even is one of those subordinating words. It's not just the word even though. It's even though, okay? See how we say even and though together? I wasn't even trying to do it there, and I did because we use those two words together. And sometimes instead of just looking for one subordinating word, you will find that there are a couple of subordinating words as we're here in this sentence. All right, let's look at number 3 then. The province has become famous. Sure, you could stop right there. You could end with that. That is an independent clause. All right, number 4. Now, number 4 here is a little tricky. I want you to listen to me read it. I'm going to read it 2 different ways. All right, same words. The first time, that was the setting for the books. Now this time, that was the setting for the books. What do you think? The first time I read it, that was the setting for the books. That definitely sounds like a dependent clause, doesn't it? That is a relative pronoun, okay? It makes it so that it can't stand alone. And you see what it was doing? We'll talk about relative pronouns later when we get to the pronoun chapter. But it was relating that portion of the sentence back to the first part of the sentence. And you were supposed to be looking at this in conjunction in the sentence as a whole. But let's look at it one more time, the second way that I read it. And I said, that was the setting for the books. If that's all you had, that was the setting for the books. Could that stand alone? Could that be an independent clause? Sure it could, because that is a demonstrative pronoun. You see, that is one of those words in our language that goes a couple different ways. We can use it for different things. That's why you cannot just memorize lists of words and say, oh, this word is always a demonstrative pronoun, or this word is always an adjective. You can't do it that way. It just doesn't work. That's why you have to look at things in their context. So that's why this was so good, because it's saying, hey, don't look at just this group of words. No, you look at how this group of words fits into the sentence, and then you decide how it's used. So you should have written down that it is a dependent clause. I trust that you understand that. If you don't, if you say, hey, I'm just totally lost, I'm not exactly sure where you're coming from, don't worry. We will talk about it more when we talk about demonstrative pronouns, this, that, these, and those, and when we talk about relative pronouns. All right, so get to that information in the pronoun chapter. Right now, let's go ahead and look at the next sentence. This is a phrase, Prince Edward Island's only city. There's no subject, no verb. There shouldn't be any doubt about the fact that that one is a phrase. All right, let's look at the next one. If you visit Prince Edward Island. Why is that a dependent clause? What does it have? It has that word if, doesn't it? If shows that, hey, there is a subordinating word here. It cannot stand alone because I have the word if. In fact, you know something? When you are writing answers to questions, if you start with the word because, chances are you are not answering in a complete sentence. Why not? Because is one of those subordinating words. So if you just say, because he went to the store, you don't have a complete sentence. You could say, because he went to the store, he wasn't home in time for supper. You see, you've added an independent clause to it, but chances are you won't think about doing that. So if you are ever told to answer something in a complete sentence, be extremely careful about starting that sentence with the word because. All right, just throwing some of these things in for extra here, but it's very important that you learn them. And sometimes, yes, you can learn them as you're looking through your sentences, but other times you just need to remember these things because they're going to come up. All right, let's look at another set here. Number 7, these 3 structures. All right, that's a phrase, no subject, no verb there. Number 8, in 1980. This is a phrase. What kind of phrase is it? You should know. It's a prepositional phrase. Now, sometimes phrases have special names. We have prepositional phrases, we have adjectival phrases, we have adverbial phrases, but we can also have just groups of words that are phrases, okay? And they act in different ways in the sentence. But there are some that, hey, these work together very well in a sentence. We can take them out of a sentence, we can separate them, we can look at them, we can see how they're related to everything else in a sentence, and those we do give names to. All right, sentence number 9, which includes pews and an altar. Which, that's one of those words like the word that was when we were looking at it a couple sentences ago, and that's indicating, hey, this cannot stand alone. This is a dependent clause. And then the last one, number 10, you can eat plenty of lobster. You see there's sentence before this and sentence after this, but just here we have in the middle an independent clause. Right, it could stand alone. We don't have to have the part before and we don't have to have the part after. But good writers will add that into their work because it makes the sentences a little less boring. You don't have just all these short, choppy sentences. No, they've added dependent clauses to independent clauses and added phrases in. In fact, I want us to talk about the fact that you can take clauses and you can combine them to form different types of sentences. Now, I realize we've already looked at types of sentences according to their purpose. That's when we talked about the declarative sentence and the imperative sentence and the interrogative sentence and the exclamatory sentence. But now I want us to look at them according to their structure. All right, if we have a simple sentence, it is simply one independent clause. One clause that stands all by itself, that is what we call a simple sentence. However, we can do some combining here. And if we decide that we are going to combine two or more independent clauses, then we have what is called a compound sentence. With a compound sentence, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about punctuation, but there are a couple different ways that we can punctuate it. Make sure that you do it correctly. Sarah and I are friends. That's one independent clause. I'm going to put a comma, and then I have a coordinating conjunction, that word and we will be cabin mates at camp. However, I don't have to use an and. Sometimes a conjunction just doesn't seem to work in a sentence. It doesn't help the flow of the sentence like we want it to. That's fine. That's why we have another way to join these. We can join them with a semicolon. Sarah and I are friends. Semicolon. We will be cabin mates at camp. Two different ways. Make sure you do it correctly. And actually, we're going to talk more about that in the next chapter, about some problems that, or in the next lesson really, some problems that come up with punctuation. All right, let's look at another type of sentence. How about the complex sentence? What is a complex sentence? Well, think about the fact we're getting a little more complicated. We've already combined an independent clause with another independent clause, and we get a compound sentence. When we're talking about a complex sentence, we're going to have one independent clause and two or more dependent clauses. The last sentence in the group of words that you just, or group of sentences that you just looked at, that last one was a complex sentence. Now I'm going to throw one more sentence type at you, and this is a type that perhaps you are not familiar with. If you have been going through this curriculum, you've not been introduced to this kind yet, and that is the compound complex sentence. Now before I just tell you what a compound complex sentence is, I want you to do a little bit of thinking on your own. You should have written down in your notes what a compound sentence is. If you haven't, you might want to pause the program, back it up, write all that information down in your notes, okay? You are in high school, you need to be taking good notes. By the way, we're going to be looking at your notes a little bit later on in a couple more lessons, so make sure that you are taking good notes. All right, so you should have down what a compound sentence is, as well as what a complex sentence is. Now, by looking at those two definitions from your notes, I want you to come up with what a compound complex sentence is. It's going to take the character qualities of a compound sentence, and it's going to take the characteristics of a complex sentence, and it's going to bring the two of them together. So here's what a compound complex sentence is. It has one or more dependent clauses added to two or more independent clauses. All right, so we have to have at least two independent clauses plus at least one dependent clause. That gives us a compound complex sentence. All right, different types of sentences. We'll look at some problems with sentences in the next lesson. Right now, let me give you your assignment. I would like for you to work in Book 2. Book 2, page 88, Practice B. Now, we've not looked at Book 2 before, but this is what Book 2 is. Your parents should have Book 2. So make sure that you find out from them where Book 2 is, page 88, Practice B.